Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about the history and development of the lever action rifle. Now I actually find this to be a very interesting history because it is almost a wholly American endeavor. There are a couple of entries from foreign nations when we talk about the distribution of the rifle system that is the lever action. However, when it comes to advancement or development, it's all American. 100% it is as American as apple pie, and that's pretty fantastic. Now, there are a couple of caveats that we got to get into before I start this video. And first off, I'm not a historian by any means. So if I am off a little bit on my dates or anything like that, forgive me. If I'm too egregious on any of my mistakes as far as this video is concerned, I'll scrap it and start all over again, and you guys will have a better video for it. Now, in addition to that, I don't have physical representation of the vast majority of these rifles, so I'm not really going to have anything to hold up for you and show and talk about as much as I'm going to be able to roll in some pictures from open source type locations. In addition to that, I'm also not necessarily going to be able to display to you how these things function differently than one another, where a lot of the technical and mechanical differences are. One, because I again don't have access to the rifles, and two, I don't have access to the animation capability. But fear not, there are other locations on YouTube where people do have access to such things, and I will annotate those in my description. So when you get done with this video, if it's something that piqued your interest and you want to know more about one of these rifles that we're going to talk about throughout the development process, then hop into the description, pull up those videos, and learn to your heart's content. That's really what I want to do here, is kind of provide an appetizer for an interest in these concepts, to present the idea of how this thing flowed and name what the differences were, but then actually inspire someone to go out and find what those changes were and really understand the function elsewhere, because unfortunately I don't have the access that others do. Now, if there's one more caveat to throw in, it would be how I'm going to define a couple of terms. Now, to me, a lever action rifle requires three things. It requires a lever that feeds or loads and chambers the cartridge, ejects the previous cartridge, and cocks the hammer, all in the one movement of the lever, the forward and back movement of the lever. There are designs that predate where it is that I'm going to start the story at, and I don't consider those to be true lever action rifles for a couple of reasons. A lot of them were revolving type weapon systems, which all the lever did was really advance to the next chamber and did not cock the hammer. There was no real extraction or anything like that going on. So I don't really consider those to qualify for this purpose. Now, historians still consider them lever actions, though I consider them to be more of an advancement or progression of single action revolver capabilities than they do lever action rifle capabilities. That's just my opinion, and I mean, I guess in this case it's my video, so I get to start wherever I want to, but that's the reason that I'm going to start where it is that I'm going to start at. Now, I think that pretty much takes care of all of my caveats, so let's get started. Now, our story begins in 1854 with the Volcanic Arms Company, which has a wide group of investors, but the most notable of the bunch would include such names as Horace Smith, Dan Wesson, and Oliver Winchester. In addition to that, they had a designer on staff named Benjamin Tyler Henry. Now, all four of these names are absolutely huge in the firearms industry, and I can only imagine these guys at a party 10, 15 years from now discussing the good old days when they were young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed investors trying to get into the firearms community. I can just imagine them all sitting in a parlor holding glasses of bourbon and burning cigars and discussing these things while laughing at little road bumps and such that they hit along the way. Regardless, they have the Volcanic lever action pistol design, or repeating pistol design, which they also have in kind of a carbine length system. And this is a little unorthodox in a lot of ways. Now, it does have an underbarrel magazine tube, which is loaded from the front, a kind of odd looking lever for what it is that we're going to see in the future, and it almost looks like a compressed Henry, and we'll get into why that is here in a little bit. Now, this system fired a self-contained cartridge, but not a brass-cased or even copper-cased cartridge. This is more akin to like caseless ammunition, where the bullet had a hollow base where all the propellant was stuffed into. And that is really the Achilles heel of this particular design, in that that bullet was very weak It grossed about double-digit foot-pounds of energy, and really there are air rifles on the market today that are more powerful and capable than this cartridge was. Also, in addition to that, the system was expensive and the ammunition was probably a little difficult to come by at the time. So, unfortunately, the Volcanic struggled, and the later Volition also struggled. So in 1856, with the company not doing very well, Smith & Wesson decided that they would leave the company and start their own revolver business, which, I mean, we all know how that went. And Oliver Winchester decided that he would go ahead and buy out everyone else's interests in the facility and in the overall market for that particular weapon system and start his own company. Now, Oliver Winchester could do this. He was a very successful textile mogul, I guess you could say, and he was looking to diversify his portfolio as it was already. Hi, Max. Are you sneaking into my lap right now? Looks like we have a kitty. All right, buddy. Anyway, he was a successful textile industry mogul and looking to diversify his portfolio. So he was really dead set on this firearms manufacturing. I'm really glad he was, because he really helped to push along a lot of these designs. So in 1856, he forms the New Haven Repeating Arms Company, and he maintains his association with Benjamin T. Henry. And he sets Benjamin T. Henry around to making the Volcanic and Volition rifles better. And in 1860, Henry unveils the Henry Repeating Rifle, which is a 44 rimfire caliber rifle, which still feeds from a tubular magazine underneath the barrel that is loaded from the front. This time, it uses a brass case cartridge. So now we have all three of our requirements. We have a lever that feeds, ejects, and cocks the hammer, all in the forward and back movement of the lever, the cycling of the lever. And it turns out that this rifle could not have come out a moment too soon, because in 1861 the American Civil War kicks off. And it's not too long before both sides are screaming for any type of weapon system they can get their hands on, be it a technological advantage or not. So the Henry rifle enters into trials alongside the Spencer carbine. Now, a lot of experts like to call the Spencer carbine a lever action rifle, and this is something that I disagree on based on the grounds of what I mentioned previously with my 3 criteria to make a lever action rifle. The 56 caliber Spencer carbine does feed and eject with the movement of the lever. However, it does not cock. It does feed from a tubular magazine, but it's still missing that third portion. You still have to make an additional movement in order to be able to use the rifle. Excuse me. So if we call the Spencer carbine a lever action rifle, then we also call the Sharps rifles lever action rifles, the Martini Henry a lever action rifle. And I think that's just too liberal a use of the term. I really think that the other 2 portions of what makes a lever action rifle are the more critical things, and that is the proper use of the term. So that's just my opinion, guys, and it is my video, so that's what we will continue forward with. Now, both rifles wind up getting adopted. However, the Henry is quite expensive. It's more expensive than the Spencer. They're about $35 a pop, and that's the government rate, which normally would be higher, but in this case, it's actually lower. The Winchester cuts them a deal. Now, keep this in mind, because the Springfield 1861 muzzle-loading rifle costs $12 to produce. So that's quite a disparity. That's 3 times the cost. So the United States Army contracts 1,700 of those rifles, and I'm pretty sure almost all of them went to cavalry units because they did not have bayonets. And I can't imagine anybody trying to outfit soldiers in these days without bayonets, especially when the tactics of the time called for lines of infantry to exchange a couple of salvos from their muzzle-loading rifles and then bayonet charge one another. So that'd be kind of terrible to have a Henry in that case. However, that did not stop the private purchase by Union soldiers of Henry rifles, which I still can't imagine being caught up in that type of tactic with a 16-shot firearm, which once you expend those rounds, trying to load that under duress in the middle of a bayonet charge sounds terrible. At that point, you wind up having to go like Mel Gibson in The Patriot on these guys, and that's not reality. So it's kind of a sketch thing to do to begin with. Now, the rifle was nicknamed by Confederate troops that damned Yankee rifle, and it was quite popular to pick up off the battlefield by Confederate soldiers, which is also kind of an odd choice because they wouldn't be able to get a hold of ammunition very well. That stuff wasn't getting, sold commercially across the border at that time. Now, that did not stop Jefferson Davis from having his personal bodyguards outfitted with Henry lever-action rifles. Now, the war would end, and so too would the United States military's use of the 1860 Henry. However, it did not stop it from being used in conflict moving forward, and actually it wound up being used by the Sioux Native American tribe at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So it made its appearance just against U.S. cavalry this time around. Now, our next advancement comes in 1866 with the 1866 Yellow Boy Winchester repeating rifle. Winchester decides that he's going to rename the country the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Rename the company the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. And he comes out with the 1866. Now, this is a side-loading rifle, which will now come to typify all of our Winchesters moving forward. It's still a 44 rimfire. It still has a brass receiver. However, that next advancement makes it a little bit easier to load quickly and top up in the field and all that kind of stuff. So this rifle actually winds up picking up some foreign military adoption. It gets a contract from the Ottoman Empire for several hundred rifles, which wind up getting used at the Battle of Plevna in the 1870s against Russian troops. So the Turkish soldiers would utilize their single-shot rifles at distance to start picking away at the Russians as they approached, and then they would use the 1866 Yellow Boys to stop any Russian breakthroughs at their different defensive points. Now, ultimately, the Russians won the Battle of Plevna. However, they did so at a great loss, and the 1866 accounted for a lot of those losses. So, this 1866 was also considered for use by the Swiss. However, they decided to go with a homegrown design instead. Now, a lot of people ask the question, why did the United States military never adopt the lever-action rifle en masse? This was the AR-15 of its time, a rapid-fire, high-capacity system that is used almost universally, at least according to Westerns, by the shooting populace and civilian populace. Why did the United States Army never adopt it en masse? And the Army, with a few exceptions, never really does. It only ever accepts lever-action rifles and onesie-twosies. I think it has a lot to do with military tactics at the time as well as opinions. So first off, arming every soldier with a lever-action rifle is akin to arming a modern military entirely with MP5s. It doesn't make any sense, especially since a lot of times conflict either is expected to take place at longer distances or does take place at longer distances than what you normally would do with a pistol caliber carbine of some sort. So, a lot of times people will say that pistol caliber carbines are good out to like 100 yards, but conflict can definitely take place beyond that, and that's going to be an issue for a military, especially if they're maneuvering against a military that has a longer range capability than 100 yards. That means that you're under fire until you actually close with the enemy enough to be able to employ your own weapon systems. So you're losing guys. You're losing the ability to maneuver until you close to within 100 yards. That's pretty close. That is very close in military terms. Now, in addition to that, repeating arms are not necessarily being widely adopted. It's very common for single-shot rifles, especially moving into the cartridge era, to be the norm. So it is not surprising to see this resistance to the idea of repeating arms, especially from a standpoint of a soldier may expend too much ammunition too quickly. And a lot of that comes also from a time when you had an officer who told you when to load, who told you when to fire, who might even call out the elevation for which you fired off of your tangent sights and stuff like that. This wasn't a time of a lot of individual usage or trying to establish superiority by fire like we see in modern conflict. That was a very different order of the day. So we're already looking for larger carbines or larger rifles, more higher calibers, and not being able to just waste large amount of ammunition. That's why it's not in the hands of infantry. Now, it never made sense to me that it wasn't more of an option for cavalry. And I think, again, it might come to some unanticipated tactics of the time. Now, I am not an 1800s military tactician expert. All right, I'm a lot of things. An expert is not one of them. However, I had the feeling that at the time, we utilized the United States cavalry more like dragoons. And that was highly mobile infantry. You'd take these guys on horseback and you would send them ahead to occupy critical strategic positions, or perhaps occupy a position with good cover in order to either deny that to the enemy or use that to harass a flank or something like that, and then be able to evacuate that area before the enemy could cut you off or close with and destroy you, and then establish new ground that you could continue to harry the enemy from. That's how I think we were utilizing cavalry at the time, or at least I'm basing that a little bit off of some understanding of cavalry techniques, as well as the weapons that were being used. So at this time, the cavalry are using cut down Springfield trapdoor carbines. So now they have interchangeable ammunition with the infantry, and then also they still have a long-range capability and a cartridge-based rifle and all that kind of stuff. So they're able to accurately engage from distance, and then as soon as someone closes too close with them, they can hop on their horses, ride out of there to the next position or back to the lines, wherever it is that they need to be. And that would be a little more difficult to do with a lever-action rifle. And then again, it comes down to the bean counters complaining about ammunition being wasted too quickly. And now, ammunition waste also kind of has its own point of view when you consider that we were a frontier army. So they were spending a lot of time moving between bases, having patrols going out there to different forts, different towns, checking to make sure settlers weren't getting massacred and scalped and all that kind of stuff. You might be traveling with your own ammunition, 2 bandoliers, for days on end. And you may not have the opportunity, or you may have the opportunity if you had a lever action rifle to burn through a bunch of ammunition, and that's going to be a problem if it's 2 days ride back to the fort and you still might have to fight your way there and you expended a lot of your 2 bandoliers. Just some things to take into account. I don't know 100% that these are the reasons that we never adopted lever action rifles, but for the time, it makes a lot of sense to me. Now, the next notable rifle that comes out is the Winchester 1873, and this is the gun that won the West. And this is the first time that lever-action rifles have come chambered in a centerfire cartridge, in this case the 4440. And now Colt really bolstered the popularity of this rifle by making their revolvers in 4440. So now, somebody traveling across the western plains and all that kind of stuff, they could have a rifle and pistol that fired the same ammunition. They had interchangeability. All they had to do was buy one type of ammunition, and they had plenty to feed their rifle and pistol, whichever one it was that they wanted to keep using in whatever conflict that they might find themselves in. That's pretty handy, and that really spurred the popularity of the 1873. Now, Winchester had more grand ideas of where they wanted to head, and they wanted major rifle calibers in their lever-action rifle, so they came out with the 1876. Which was chambered in 40-60, 45-75, and 50-95, if I remember correctly. And these were supposed to be aimed at the buffalo hunting market. Now, of those options, the 50-95 was the closest to something that was popular in buffalo hunting. However, the problem with all 3 of these cartridges is that they are specialty Winchester cartridges, so you had to most likely special order them. They probably were not available at whatever general store that you walked into, and that really hurt the rifle. Now, from a design standpoint, the 1876 was the epitome of the toggle link system. So it had that going for it. However, as far as commercial sales were concerned, it really didn't do that hot. Now, that's when Marlin enters the scene in 1881 and comes out with their Marlin 1881 lever-action rifle in 45-70. Now, this was actually a partnership with a man named Burgess to come up with this rifle. And it really gave Winchester a run for its money from the standpoint of being chambered in 4570, and that is an actual popular cartridge. That's something that was already available for the Sharps rifles. It was already accessible to the shooting public, and that really boosted its sales. Well, that really made Winchester mad. Now, an issue in general with these large caliber 45 or Buffalo capable rifles is that they are big and they are heavy, because unfortunately lever action rifles are not space savvy designs. There's a lot going on inside of that receiver, that lever and the lifters and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't leave a lot of space for other stuff. It doesn't leave a lot of space for longer cartridges. You have to elongate the entire system in order to be able to fit more cartridges, which means that you have a heavier overall rifle, pushing past 10 pounds. Now, in 1885, Winchester had their high wall rifle come out, and this partnership with John Moses Browning, so they decided to set this very brilliant man about designing a more capable and already commercially viable lever action rifle for commercially viable lever action cartridges, or I guess rifle cartridges. So John Moses Browning comes out with the 1886 lever action rifle, which is chambered in 4570 and 5110, both of which are popular cartridges. The 4570 obviously already available on the market, and the 5110 being a very popular buffalo hunting cartridge. Now, this rifle is of course beefy, but it also has a very beefy locking system, which winds up being to the benefit of Winchester, because in that very same year, the French unveiled smokeless powder. Now, smokeless powder, as compared to black powder, has a much higher burn pressure and burning rate, which means that for a lot of black powder designs, it is too powerful. It'll overpower the locking lugs, or it'll eventually bend the locking lugs and really change the safety aspects of the rifle. But that wasn't an issue, at least from the standpoint of the locking lugs, for the 1886. The barrel needed to be improved, but the lockup was perfectly fine, as it would turn out, for smokeless powder, which gave Winchester a competitive edge in the rifle market. Now, Winchester returned to John Moses Browning and asked him if he would be able to do the same overall trick that he did with the 1886, but with a smaller caliber option. And they offered him a large sum of money if he could do it within a year, and then offered him a bonus if he could get it done in 6 months, to which John Moses Browning replied that if he didn't have it done in a month, he would do it for free. And as it would turn out, he would have it done in just a couple of weeks. And thus was born the 1892 lever action rifle for pistol cartridges in this case, which is just a more or less shrunken down 1886. And this became an immensely popular rifle, not only for the time, but also in the future for media like movies and TV shows and the like. Now, Marlin decided to go ahead in 1893 add their own pistol caliber lever action rifle as well to compete with the 1892. Well, as it turns out, no one, at least on the commercial market as of yet, had really been able to take advantage of smokeless powder. It was definitely there was a massive race in military circles to be able to take full advantage of a lot of the higher velocities that smokeless powder could produce, especially when combined with small caliber bullets. But that wasn't as prevalent in the civilian market. So Winchester turned to John Moses Browning yet again and asked him to develop a rifle that would be able to chamber a smokeless powder, small bore cartridge, but in a smaller, lighter overall package, a shorter receiver. And thus, the Winchester 1894 was born. Now, in order to be able to fit these longer cartridges into the lever action rifle, John Moses Browning made it so that when you opened the lever, the bottom of the receiver fell out, so that you would have more space for the cycling of those cartridges. So that cartridge now has extra space to be able to fall into and then be chambered into the rifle, which is pretty fantastic. It's so simple, it's surprising that no one thought of it beforehand. Now, by 1895, this was chambered for the .30 Winchester centerfire, or 30-30 Winchester as it's referred to, and became an immensely popular rifle with 7 million of them produced by today's date. Well, now, 1895 becomes a huge year for the lever action rifle, and unfortunately one of the last big years for the lever action rifle. Now, something to throw out there about the 1892 and 1894 is that both actually saw service in World War I. The 1892 was purchased by the British Navy, as was the 1894. The French also purchased several thousand in the 1894, and actually the United States Signal Corps ordered just over 1,000 of the Winchester Model 1894. Now, during this time, let's see, where are we now? 1895. Well, Marlin comes out with yet another 4570 cartridge, or 4570 rifle, as it turned out that the 1881 was not compatible with smokeless powder 4570 cartridges. The lockup wasn't strong enough for it. So they came out with their model 1895. However, the 1895 would pretty much struggle for years because, as it would turn out, nobody had an interest in large bore cartridges at this point. Everyone wanted small bore cartridges. Now, other manufacturers in 1895 came up with a couple of different things. The Savage company unveiled their model 1895, which was actually an updated model 1892. The 1892 had been entered into trials against the Krag Jorgensen, chambered in the 3040 Krag, as an attempt to net a lever action rifle in standard U.S. service. However, the United States Army went with the Krag Jorgensen rifle. Now, the 1895 Savage had an internal hammer, which is definitely different from anything else, as well as a rotary magazine, which allowed it to be chambered for Spitzer-type cartridges, because as it turns out, if you stack a bunch of pointy cartridges in a tubular magazine, you potentially can have a chain detonation from one Spitzer cartridge impinging the primer of another. It's kind of a big issue. So the 1895 Savage was chambered in 303 Savage, 3040 Krag, and a couple of other cartridges, as well as 3030. Up until 1899, when a revolutionary cartridge came out for the Savage rifle, which is called the 250 Savage, or the 250-3000. And this was a 250 caliber cartridge that was capable of achieving 3,000 feet per second. And actually, before all was said and done, and definitely by the time that the 1899 Savage ended production in 1998, that cartridge had gotten up to near 4,000 feet per second. This was the highest velocity cartridge of its time. This was the time when people were getting excited over 2,000 feet per second, and all of a sudden you have a 3,000 feet per second cartridge. Now, also in 1895, Winchester came out with their model 1895 lever action rifle, which was an attempt to grab some military usage. However, it did not, initially, at least right off the bat. The New York National Guard entertained the rifle for a little bit. However, it wound up going with the 1895 musket lever action rifle from Savage, which musket in this case just means that it's a longer overall rifle with a handguard and stuff like that. Now, the Winchester 1895 is an interesting option because it's an internal box magazine, a lot like a bolt action rifle, which again makes it applicable for Spitzer type cartridges, which means that it can be chambered for 30-06, 3040 Krag, 303 British, all that kind of stuff, in addition to 405 Winchester, which was a favorite of Teddy Roosevelt for hunting African game. He actually absolutely loved the Winchester Model 1895. It was one of his favorite rifles. Now, the 1895 would actually wind up netting itself a contract with the Russian army during World War I, in which 500,000 rifles were ordered, chambered for 7.62 by 5.4. These rifles also had the addition of a stripper clip feed capability, a handguard added, and a bayonet lug, which is pretty cool. I would love to get my hands on one of those rifles, but they are extremely rare. Now, in the 1930s, Marlin wound up making a couple of changes to its rifles. It dropped the Model 1894 and picked up the Model 336, which would look an awful lot like this rifle. However, this is a Marlin Model 30 AW, which is one of their cheaper models. Now, the Model 336 includes side ejection, which at the time, I don't think Marlin realized how important that would be. When it comes to mounting a scope, it is far easier to mount a scope on a Marlin side eject rifle than it is on any top eject rifle. Whenever you mount a scope on a top eject rifle, you have to go with an offset scope mount, which means that you run into parallax as well as cheek weld issues. However, with the side eject scopes, you can have a centrally located scope. Now, Winchester wouldn't address this issue up until the 90s, where they would change their ejection from going straight up 90 degrees top eject to a 45-degree top eject, which would actually allow the mounting of scopes. And Marlin would take this 336, as they called it, the refined Model 1894 was the 336, and they would also apply this type of receiver to their Model 1895 4570 in order to make it a little more applicable on the market, which it helped boost sales, but really it took a long time for the Model 1895 to catch on. Now that would almost leave our story complete if not for the Browning Lever Action Rifle, or BLR. Now this came out, and its big claim to fame is, one, it has a detachable box magazine, and two, this rifle is chambered in Magnum cartridges like the 300 Win Mag or 7mm mag, and manages to achieve lockup as well as feeding through a ratcheting lever system. It kind of dropped the toggle link and went to a ratchet system, which is extremely interesting. Well, guys, that's pretty much the wave tops of the history of the development of lever action rifles. I hope you guys found it interesting. I hope it piqued your interest. Now, when it comes to the later Winchester production aspect of this, and also some of the earlier guns, a channel called C&Rsenal has quite a few videos covering those rifles and really goes in depth into that company and what it was that it managed to put together and produce. And I highly recommend those videos. I will throw the links in the description, and that'll really give you a lot of the animation and nitty-gritty details of how these rifles actually function. But I hope you guys found this video interesting, helpful, and thought-provoking, and that's pretty much what I got. So catch you guys later.